Hello, and welcome back to Forgotten Ties. Look closely at the screen, folks, because what you are about to hear isn't just a story. It's a chilling echo from a past that refused to stay buried. It starts, as all great tragedies do, with something profoundly innocent. A simple, forgotten toy. Our focus today is on Tommy Rourke, a name that, until very recently, belonged to a man living the quiet, almost aggressively average American dream in the suburbs of Portland, Oregon. Tommy, a man whose hands, thick and scarred from years of carpentry, told a story of hard work and simple pleasures. At 45, he had the kind of reliable life you build brick by painstaking brick. A loving, if somewhat reserved, wife named Sarah, and 2 children who were just starting to escape the nest. His hair was thinning at the temples, but his eyes, a shocking, vibrant blue, still held a youthful spark. A spark that was about to be extinguished by the weight of a memory he never knew he'd lost. The irony, the crushing, cruel irony of fate, began not in a dusty attic or a forgotten lockbox, but in the glaring, mundane heat of a July afternoon. Tommy and Sarah had just purchased their new home, a charming, albeit slightly neglected, Victorian-style house built in the 1920s. It sat on a generous corner lot, the kind of property realtors love to call a blank canvas. Their very first project? Ripping out the overgrown, suffocating ivy and the century-old, gnarled blackberry bushes that had claimed the back corner of the yard. Tommy was battling a root system that felt ancient, a subterranean serpent wrapped around something he couldn't see. He was using a pickaxe, the kind that makes you grunt with every swing, when the metallic clink resonated. It wasn't the dull thud of rock, but a higher, sharper sound. Curious, almost annoyed by the interruption to his Sisyphean task, he dug around the spot. The soil was rich, dark, and damp, smelling of old decay and fresh earth. What he pulled out, slowly, coated in a thick, reddish-brown patina of mud and time, was small. It was a toy car, not a Hot Wheels, not some mass-produced plastic junk, but an old, heavy metal car. A faded cherry-red firetruck, its tiny, delicate ladder long gone, but its shape unmistakable. It was about 4 inches long, chipped, scratched, and utterly ruined by the elements. Any normal person would have tossed it aside, an artifact of a stranger's childhood. But Tommy paused. He wiped the dirt off with his thumb, and something shifted inside him. A cold, sharp sensation, like a flash of ice water, hit his chest. This car wasn't just a toy. It was the toy. He stood there, frozen, the pickaxe dangling from his other hand, its shadow stretching long and thin across the overgrown lawn. He knew this car, not from a catalog, not from a museum display of vintage toys. He knew the slight dent on the front fender, the almost imperceptible discoloration on the roof where a sticker used to be. He knew it because, in the deepest, most inaccessible corner of his mind, a silent alarm was ringing. Tommy was not a man prone to hysterics. He was grounded, practical. But as he stood in that stranger's backyard, holding this relic, a memory, fragmented and terrifying, broke through the dam of his conscious thought. He saw a flash. A small hand, his hand, perhaps, clutching this very car. He saw bright sunlight, a burst of color, and then darkness. A sound, a shriek, cut off too quickly. He raced inside, his heart pounding a desperate rhythm against his ribs. Sarah, who was organizing boxes in the kitchen, looked up, startled by the manic energy radiating from him. Her expression, usually calm and measured, twisted into concern. "Tommy, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost," she asked, wiping her hands on her jeans. He didn't answer. He just held out the car, his hand trembling so violently that the mud flakes dusted the floor. I know this," he choked out, the words tasting like rust and dirt. "Sarah, this was mine. When I was a kid. I haven't seen it in 40 years. Sarah took the car, turning it over in her palm. She frowned. "Darling, all kids had firetrucks. It's an old one, sure. Maybe the previous owner's child left it." But the look in Tommy's eyes was primal, an absolute certainty that defied logic. He snatched it back, almost possessively. No, no, you don't understand. I lost it. I remember losing it. I was 5. I was playing with it and then I couldn't find it. I was devastated. My parents had to buy me a different one. His gaze drifted back towards the exact spot in the yard, a small, innocent patch of earth now marked with his turmoil. But this isn't my childhood home, Sarah. Not even close. My parents sold our old house 15 states away, decades ago. The house they were in, this beautiful old Victorian, was miles, a whole history, away from where Thomas Rourke grew up. So, how could his childhood, prized possession, the exact one he remembered losing, be buried 3 feet deep in a stranger's backyard? The implications hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a misplaced puzzle piece, a horrifying signature left on a canvas he didn't recognize. And the chilling thought that began to worm its way into Tommy's mind, a thought that would eventually consume him, was this. If the toy is here, was I here too? And if so, why? This small, red firetruck wasn't just a found object. It was a key, a rusted, mud-caked key to a door he'd spent a lifetime keeping locked, a door to a memory so traumatic his mind had mercifully erased it. And the truth, my friends, the truth Tommy was about to uncover, was infinitely darker and more twisted than any innocent childhood tale of a lost toy. Stay with Forgotten Ties as we dig deeper into the soil of Thomas Rourke's lost life. The discovery of the toy car became an obsession, a malignant growth on the otherwise healthy tissue of Tommy's stable life. He couldn't sleep. He saw the red flash every time he closed his eyes, heard that high-pitched, clipped shriek in the moments between waking and dreaming. Sarah tried to be the voice of reason, the anchor, but even she couldn't deny the terrifying shift in her husband. His blue eyes, once so clear, were now clouded with a frantic, desperate searching. Tommy began to investigate the house itself. Not just a home inspection, but a forensic examination. He started with the previous owners. They were an elderly couple, the Millers, who had lived there for 50 years and recently moved to a nursing home. Tommy's first call to the facility was met with polite, professional resistance. The Millers were frail, confused, suffering from severe dementia. Their memories were fragmented, useless. The trail was cold before it even began. But Tommy couldn't stop. He moved on to the house's history. The Victorian had been built by a prosperous lumber baron in 1928, sold in the 1950s, and then purchased by the Millers in 1975. Tommy was born in 1980, thousands of miles away. The timelines simply did not align. The geographic disconnect was the gaping hole in the center of the mystery. How could a 5-year-old Tommy, living in upstate New York, have lost his favorite toy in a backyard in Portland, Oregon? He became a ghost in his own life, poring over digitized property records and archival newspaper clippings. One rainy Tuesday, while hunched over a microfilm reader at the Portland Historical Society, a name finally snagged his attention. A small, insignificant detail from the 1970s. The Millers had briefly leased the house to a family for 6 months before officially moving in. The name of the leaseholder, the Rourke family. Tommy's blood ran cold. The coincidence was too profound, too cruel. Rourke was a common enough surname, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He tracked the records further, finding the lease agreement. The tenants were listed as Elias and Margaret Rourke, not Thomas's parents, whose names were William and Eleanor. A dead end? Maybe. But the car, that damned, silent red car in his hand, said otherwise. He decided on a deeper, more drastic step. He hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Alastair Vance, a man with a tired face and eyes that had seen too much. Vance was initially skeptical, humoring a man clearly disturbed by a mere toy. But as Tommy laid out the details, the exact location, the car's unique flaws, the gut-wrenching certainty, Vance's professional curiosity was piqued. "Look, Mr. Rourke," Vance said, running a finger over the miniature fender. "This is extremely long-shot stuff, but if you're absolutely sure, we follow the threads. Vance's work was methodical, contrasting sharply with Tommy's frantic searching. He dove into public records databases, focusing on Elias and Margaret Rourke from the 1975 lease. What he found wasn't just interesting. It was a devastating narrative of loss and tragedy. Elias and Margaret Rourke had a son, a boy named Michael Rourke, age 5. The local newspaper archive yielded the chilling headline from November 1975. 5-year-old Michael Rourke missing from West Portland home. Presumed abduction. Michael had vanished without a trace from the backyard of the house Tommy now owned. The search had been massive, the local community devastated, but the case went cold quickly. The last sighting was Michael playing with his new red firetruck, the kind of heavy metal toy his uncle had brought back from Europe. The details matched the toy exactly. Tommy felt a violent, dizzying wave of nausea. He wasn't Michael Rourke. He was Thomas Rourke. But the car was the physical, undeniable link to a tragedy that had unfolded on the very soil he now walked. Vance continued, his voice low and grave. The parents, Elias and Margaret, never recovered. They moved away a month after the disappearance, broke the lease, and simply vanished from the public record. They didn't want the house. It was cursed to them. Tommy's hands gripped the edge of the desk so tightly his knuckles were white. "So I found Michael's toy," he whispered, the realization a dull, crushing pain. "It's a memorial." "Maybe," Vance countered, his eyes boring into Tommy's. "But there's something else." When Michael went missing, the police report mentioned a witness. A little boy, about the same age, who lived 2 blocks away. He was interviewed, said he was playing with Michael that day, said he saw a big scary shadow just before Michael disappeared. Who was he? Tommy demanded, his breath ragged. Vance leaned forward, his voice a conspiratorial rumble. The witness's name? A 5-year-old boy named Thomas Rourke. The world tilted for Tommy. Thomas Rourke. Not Elias and Margaret's son, Michael, but him. He, Tommy, had been in Portland that year. He, Tommy, had been the last person to see Michael alive. He hadn't been living in upstate New York. His parents, William and Eleanor Rourke, must have been visiting, or perhaps had a temporary living arrangement nearby. The memory that had tried to surface when he held the car, the flash of sunlight, the shriek, the darkness, wasn't a dream of a lost toy. It was the trauma of witnessing an abduction. His mind, in an act of desperate self-preservation, had performed a total memory wipe, shielding him from the horror. But the most gut-wrenching truth was still waiting. Tommy realized the profound, almost biblical irony of the situation. He hadn't just found a stranger's toy. He had found the physical evidence of his own buried trauma, a trauma that linked him inextricably to this house, to this spot. And if his mind had forgotten the abduction, what else had it buried? He looked down at the red car, no longer a relic, but a blood-stained piece of evidence, and a terrifying question formed. What if the shadow the witness saw wasn't just a shadow? What if it was him? What if the witness report was flawed? What if his mind had buried a truth far worse than just being a witness? What if Tommy Rourke was the only key to finding out what happened to Michael Rourke? The hunt was on, but now Tommy was hunting his own ghost. The revelation that he was the witness, the last person to see Michael Rourke alive, didn't bring closure. It brought a torrent of terrifying uncertainty. The memory erasure was a powerful shield, but Tommy now felt a monstrous weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Every tick of the clock was a moment lost in the 50-year-old cold case. Tommy and Vance decided to take the only path left, confront the ghosts of his past. The simplest, yet most difficult, was to contact his own parents, William and Eleanor Rourke, who were now retired and living in Florida. Tommy hadn't spoken to them about his childhood beyond the typical holiday small talk for decades. He knew the conversation would shatter the carefully constructed peace of their retirement. He flew to Florida alone, the red firetruck tucked securely in his carry-on bag, a silent, damning witness. The reunion was strained. William Rourke, a tall, imposing man who had always valued control, was visibly uneasy. Eleanor, her face lined with the faint, indelible marks of some past sorrow, was immediately defensive. Tommy didn't mince words. He laid the firetruck on their pristine mahogany coffee table. "Mom, Dad, do you remember this?" Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, a sharp, ragged intake of breath. William's face drained of color, his jaw clenching so hard Tommy could see the muscle twitch. That's just an old toy, Tommy. Where did you get that junk?" William stammered, his usual steady voice wobbling. "Don't lie to me, Dad," Tommy said, his voice hard, betraying the turmoil underneath. "I found it buried in the backyard of a house in Portland, the house where Michael Rourke disappeared in 1975. The boy I was supposedly playing with right before he was abducted." Eleanor burst into tears, a sound that was both a shriek and a sob. William stood up, his height making him seem menacing. "That was a long time ago, Thomas. We protected you. We did what we thought was best. The dam broke. The secret that had been the foundation of Tommy's life turned out to be a lie built on silence and fear." William finally confessed the horrific truth. In 1975, he had briefly taken a job in Portland, bringing the family along for a 6-month stint. They had rented a house just 2 blocks from the Millers. Tommy, an only child and a lonely boy, had befriended Michael Rourke. On that fateful day, Tommy, the witness, was terrified. He was 5 years old, and he had seen something so profoundly disturbing that he was catatonic. He didn't just see a big shadow. He had seen the abductor, and he had heard Michael call out a name. "He was pointing, Tommy. Screaming." Eleanor choked out between sobs. "He kept pointing to his playmate, Michael, and then he just shut down. He couldn't speak for a week. The doctors said it was severe trauma, dissociative amnesia." The Rourkes, William and Eleanor, were terrified of the police, terrified of the media circus, and terrified of what their son might have truly witnessed, or worse, what he might have accidentally caused. William had a violent temper and a history of explosive outbursts, which he had struggled to control. In their panic, they did the unthinkable. They packed up immediately. They told the police they were leaving the state, effectively cutting off their son, the key witness, from the investigation. They told Tommy a total fabrication, that they had moved from upstate New York, that he had lost his red car there, and that they had bought him a new one. They literally rebuilt his history, replacing the trauma with an invented, benign past. "And the toy, Dad?" Tommy pressed, his face a mask of accusation and pain. "How did my car end up in that yard, buried 3 feet deep?" William hesitated, his eyes darting away. The truth, when it finally emerged, was a sickening twist. "When we left, Tommy, you were still clinging to that car, talking nonsense about Michael and the shadow. Eleanor thought that if the car was gone, the memory would be gone too. It was an irrational, desperate move. They had driven past the Miller's house one last time. Eleanor, in a moment of crazed, superstitious desperation, had buried the car deep in the backyard. Not to protect the evidence, but to bury the memory. It was a sacrifice, a dark ritual to sever the connection between their son and the horrific event. The confession was a brutal, agonizing scene. But Tommy still didn't have the abductor's name. "What did I see, Mom? What did Michael say? What did I forget?" Tommy pleaded. Eleanor shook her head, her eyes wide with terror. "We only remember what we told the police, Tommy. The shadow, the screaming. Please, stop. You're going to break again." But Tommy was already broken. He was a man whose entire life was a lie, a protective shell built by 2 terrified parents. He realized the most crucial piece of the puzzle wasn't in any archive. It was locked inside his own shattered mind. He had to go back to the source, back to the house, and let the trauma speak. The red car, his forgotten twin's last possession, was now his spiritual guide into the darkness. But what if the darkness he was about to enter was a self-portrait? What if the shadow was someone terrifyingly close to home? The line between witness and suspect was about to blur, irrevocably. Tommy returned to Portland, the Victorian house no longer a home, but a crime scene waiting to be solved. He stood in the backyard, exactly where he had unearthed the firetruck, the the very spot where Michael Rourke had vanished 5 decades ago. He was alone, Sarah having retreated, unable to cope with the sheer scale of the deception that had been her husband's life. Vance, the detective, was waiting for him inside, a fresh cup of coffee and a final, chilling piece of documentation on the table. It was a partial transcript from a long-lost supplemental police report, detailing a separate, unconfirmed event that took place just hours before Michael's disappearance. "I pulled every thread on William Rourke I could find," Vance stated, his voice flat. "Your father had an incident at the construction site he was supervising that day. A massive argument with a subcontractor. Report says your father physically assaulted him, nearly hospitalized the man. William Rourke was a dangerous man with a hair-trigger temper, Tommy." This detail, combined with William and Eleanor's desperate, frantic actions, painted a terrifying picture. They weren't just terrified parents trying to shield a traumatized son. They were terrified of exposure. Tommy looked at the transcript, then at the red car. "The shadow, the big scary shadow, the one I saw. It wasn't a stranger, Alistair. I know it wasn't. It was someone I knew, someone I was scared of." He closed his eyes, forcing his mind back to the moment of trauma, using the car as a mental anchor. The smell of rich, damp earth, the sound of a child's excited giggles, and then a shift, a low, guttural voice, a sudden, jarring silence. He gripped the car, digging the sharp edges into his palm. He focused on Michael's last words, the sound his 5-year-old self had repressed. He heard a name. Suddenly, the shield broke. The memory didn't rush in. It exploded, a violent, blinding flash of pure, unadulterated terror. Michael Rourke was playing. Tommy was watching. A large, menacing figure appeared at the edge of the yard. Not a stranger, but William Rourke, Tommy's father. William was looking for Tommy, furious, having just had the argument at the work site, his temper already boiling over. Michael, seeing William, pointed and shouted a name, the name he had heard Tommy use for his father. But he didn't call him Dad. He called him, Rourke. "He's here." William, already in a rage, saw Michael pointing, his young voice echoing through the quiet suburban street. William, fearing the child would alert the neighborhood to his violent state, reacted with a single devastating impulse. He grabbed Michael, covering his mouth to silence him, intending only to drag the boy into the garage and silence his screams. But the desperate, violent grip, the overwhelming adult force applied to a small 5-year-old throat. It was too much. It was an accident. A horrifying, momentary explosion of rage. Tommy's 5-year-old self saw his father, his protector, do something monstrous. He saw the struggle, the fear in Michael's eyes, and then the sudden, sickening stillness. The big scary shadow wasn't an abductor. It was William Rourke, his own father, covering his mouth and silencing a child, permanently. William had buried Michael's body in a frantic, desperate attempt to cover up a manslaughter that was born of a moment of explosive rage. He had then buried the only piece of physical evidence linking Tommy to the house, the car, to ensure his son's amnesia was permanent, protecting himself not only from the law, but from his own son's knowledge. Tommy opened his eyes, tears streaming down his face, his body convulsing with a grief that wasn't just for Michael, but for the life he never had, the life not built on a terrifying lie. He knew what he had to do. The silence had protected a monster for 5 decades. Tommy contacted the Portland Police Department. He met with the cold case unit, telling them everything, presenting the red firetruck, Michael's last toy, his own childhood anchor, as the definitive, undeniable evidence. Vance backed up the discovery and the confession of William and Eleanor's frantic cover-up. Within 48 hours, William Rourke, now a frail, retired man in his 70s, was arrested at his Florida home. The trauma of 5 decades of silence had finally been exposed. With a search warrant, the police excavated the deepest, darkest corner of the Miller's old garage, finding what was left of Michael Rourke, finally bringing him home. The red firetruck, found buried in a stranger's backyard, wasn't just a toy. It was the final, devastating tie to a truth so dark, it had been erased from memory. It was the proof that the biggest monsters are often the ones you trust the most. Tommy Rourke lost his father, lost the life he thought he had, but in the process, he found himself the true witness, and he brought a little boy named Michael Rourke the peace he had been denied for half a century. And that, my friends, is the chilling, heart-wrenching power of forgotten ties. If this story, this unearthing of a devastating truth, has shaken you to the core, then you know what to do. Like this video, subscribe to our channel to make sure you never miss another deep dive into the shadows of human memory, and most importantly, turn on those notifications. The past is never truly buried. Sometimes, all it takes is a rusted red firetruck to dig it up.